Tom Greatrex.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are a couple of issues I wanted to touch on in the brief time we've got available to me. Firstly, in relation to the changes to the carbon price floor, which I intervened on the Secretary of State on earlier. I probably shouldn't be surprised, but I am frankly concerned that the Secretary of State for Business didn't appear to know the compensation scheme for the carbon price floor announced in November 2011 and due to come into effect in April of last year has so far paid out precisely nothing to energy-intensive industries. So when we hear, and when businesses like the brickworks, steel plant and glass fabricator in my constituency, energy-intensive industries, hear that there will be a compensation package on relation to the renewable obligation, the feed-in tariff, given it seems highly unlikely that the backdated scheme that they previously promised is going to be delivered, it's not surprising that they are dubious about whether or not they will ever actually see that benefit. But there is overall, I think, a supreme irony in the government's moves to limit the impact of the carbon price floor and characterising it as a green tax. Indeed, the Energy Minister at last year's Conservative Party conference referred to it as assisted suicide on manufacturing industry when he seemed not to realise it was actually his Chancellor's policy and his party voted for it, whereas we opposed introducing it without an assessment of the impact on manufacturing industry. And the Chancellor was at it again yesterday, and the member for Clapton, who isn't no longer in his place, in his speech as well, by implying that actually the answer is the impact of shale gas, and that shale on the US could have the same impact in the UK, which is a simplistic and highly misleading extrapolation of the US experience, because with different geology, land rights and crucially the inability of the US to export that shale gas, those simplistic extrapolations are either ill-informed or spectacularly and deliberately ignorant. The OBR figures on oil revenues are not just a salutary warning on the danger of over-reliance on a resource that is by definition declining and by record volatile. Whilst the SNP in Scotland are engaged in a process of taking the most optimistic assessment of gross value and suggesting that as state revenue to seek to persuade my constituents and others to vote to leave the UK, the lesson from those figures is again that pooling and sharing of resources is a much more stable proposition in maximising economic recovery from what Sir Ian Wood and his report, which the government seems to be accepting in terms of recommendations, has quite rightly referred to as a mostly mature basin. The Chancellor yesterday also referred to the extension of the film tax credit, which is welcome, but many British films today are co-productions, and indeed the critically acclaimed Under the Skin, which was filmed in and around Glasgow starring Scarlett Johansson, released just last week, is just one recent example of a stunning co-production from Britain and other countries. Yet at the same time as there's been a marginal extension in the tax credit, it's hindered by the news that just last week the HMRC issued a clarificatory note which excludes co-production from access to funding under the Enterprise Investment Scheme. And I asked the Arts Minister about this at DCM questions last week, and again, he didn't appear to know anything about it. So a developing and concerning theme of ministers not knowing the impact of their own policies. Finally, I briefly wanted to refer to changes in relation to gambling, because increasing the tax take on FOB-Ts doesn't do anything to deal with the adverse effects of those machines on many communities up and down the country. Indeed, it may have the opposite effect and impact on putting the Treasury into the box of those defending the vested interests in high-stakes, fast-pay gambling machines, which are currently ruining many lives. And finally, on bingo, I'll just to say that I welcome the change in relation to the bingo tax, but the shortly to be, I'm sure, promoted to Senior Minister of State somewhere, Tory party chairman, I think slightly let the cat out of the bag with his poster or infographic or whatever he's trying to describe it as today, last night, and referring to something that they enjoy. Now let me just say to the Minister on the bench, I'm a fairly frequent visitor to the Mecca Bingo in Rutherglen. It's a very good community institution, and very many people in my constituency enjoy that as a way of social interaction as well as enjoying gambling as a leisure pursuit. But what they tell me they wanted from this budget is actually some real action on energy bills, particularly when bills have gone up £300 in a time when the latter part of that time gas wholesale prices have been largely stable. They want to know why it is that the banker's bonus culture has been extending and deepening in this country. They want to know why it is that the primary act of this Chancellor and his ministerial team is to institute a tax cut for millionaires rather than for hard-working people. For them, this budget has precious little.